Welcome, everyone. Really glad to have you all here. So, I'm your host today, Annie, and for the next 40 minutes, we're going to get into something that I think is very important. Where is the most SaaS teams are feeling the pain and what everyone is not actually talking about? So, let's talk about why the great products fail. And most of the time, it is not because the product is bad or the market is wrong. Things usually start going off track after the deal is signed and in the part of the business that does not always get the attention that it truly deserves. So, joining me in the webinar today is Raghav, who is the head of marketing at Beacon.li. Raghav has been working closely with the customer success and implementation teams to help understand their pain points, and he has a really clear view of where the SaaS companies are going on. So, welcome to have you here, Raghav.
Thank you so much, Annie. Really happy to be here. And thank you for that introduction. So, the thing is, almost everyone in PS has a war story, and almost always there's more than one. Uh, but but why this topic is super important is because it never becomes a systems conversation and usually becomes this personal anecdote that people tend to share. Uh, I just want to start with a moment that I would like you to picture. Now, a team has spent weeks trying to get a system ready. Everyone has put in the work. The go live day has come. The client team is on the call. The leadership is watching. You start walking them through the entire system setup and how it's been built. And then there's absolute radio silence, crickets, right? And someone from the client team says that this is not what we expected. And it's in that moment that it doesn't matter how good your product is. The deal has already started to die, or they're already thinking about churning or trying out some other vendor, right? And this is not a rare situation. There's research that shows that somewhere between 40 to 60% of SaaS churn happens during the implementation or the onboarding stage, and due to those problems that occur, and and this churn ends up happening in the first 90 days itself. So that's when they sort of make up their mind whether they want to stick to you or move on. And it's not the product necessarily. It's not the market, but it's usually after the deal closes that sort of impacts the churn. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So, Raghav, there is this idea that the bad implementation is a real killer for the SaaS success right now, more than the product or the pricing. So, what is your take on this?
Yeah. I would say that for most companies that are struggling with retention, it's definitely true. And it's usually problems that start during implementation kind of trickle downwards and then kind of impact retention and the overall customer experience. And I'd like you to picture the sales process, right? Now, what happens during the sale is that the demo is controlled. Everything is sort of canned, right? So the use case will land perfectly. The client is impressed. They end up signing. Everyone's excited. And usually, what ends up happening is that, uh, you know, you don't really account for what really happens when you're trying to implement this in their real environment, right? There's legacy data, there's existing integrations, there's a lot of tribal knowledge, internal politics about who owns the system. So what ends up happening is that whatever the client saw during the clean demo is it sort of disappears almost immediately. And the core problem is this, right? So everything that was discussed during sales, every verbal yes from the sales team, that where they say that yes, we can do it, every scope conversation, it has to be translated into a verbal document and handed over to your professional services or customer success team with the same fidelity, right? And what ends up happening is that chain kind of gets broken at pretty much every link. So what's important is to kind of translate whatever the sales team sold into reality. And the reality is that it usually does not. So you have multiple versions, or rather two versions of what was agreed upon. So there's something that the sales team promised, and then there's what the client team's champion heard, and then the CS team inherits that conflict, whatever mismatch exists. from day one or day zero before even, let's say, a single line of configuration or code has been touched. Now this tends to have a domino effect. So from day you start, all of these blockers start adding up, right? Those weeks stack up. Everyone is just pushing to kind of ship something, and whatever was sort of promised originally gets buried. So the customer ends up with a system that works but doesn't exactly deliver what was expected. So that's when the churn signals also start showing up, because most of these conversations might happen during the renewal, but it's happened way before, even during the implementation itself. So months before the renewal, actually, conversation is supposed to happen. So now I can make this a little, if I were to kind of break this down into an anecdote, maybe we can imagine like a large HRMS company, right? So they have a deployment for a company with multiple entities. The system needs to be configured with leave policies, approval chains, role hierarchies, permissions that are different across different regions. Now, the sales team, let's say for this HRMS, said that it was a standard setup. And the client, what they understood was that this is a fairly straightforward and a fast rollout. But the implementation team received partial notes, right? So there were a lot of missing details. So what ends up happening is the gap between what was sold and what was handed off. And that's where, things start to kind of break.
Oh, interesting. So, Raghav, is this what exactly that implementation gap means? Can you help us identify a proper definition that the leaders can actually map to their own teams and their own revenue outcomes?
Sure. So exactly. So that's exactly what the implementation gap is. So it's basically the distance between what was sold and what was delivered in their environment. So, and it's usually, and it's dangerous for multiple reasons, but I'm going to try and break it down into three broad reasons. One is that your customer doesn't know what is happening. So, there's stuff that's not in your internal Slack. They're not, these are not on your sync calls or notes, right? So they just, all they see is basically timelines that are slipping, or you've sort of committed to something and then it's not getting delivered on time, right? And they start wondering if they've even made the right call choosing you over, let's say, some other vendor, right? Then the internal conflict. So basically, your own teams are not aligning. Your sales, professional services, sometimes your product and engineering team, they're all working with different versions of the truth. So there's no single source of reality that everyone is sort of working from. And that's super dangerous as well, because if you don't have that internal alignment, you can't really put up this united front in front of your client, right? And and the third piece is where your value keeps getting pushed out. So every week of delay is a week that the customer is not really seeing any sort of return on their investment. So their case for renewing your software gets even weaker with this passing time. And just going back to that same HRMS example, so let's say by week three, if your implementation team is still trying to resolve leave policy dependencies that should have scoped out during, either the sales call or the kickoff call, uh, now it's not happened, and the client is expecting visible progress, but instead what they're seeing is confusion. So timelines are slipping, and those downstream effects are compounding super quickly, right? So revenue recognition is getting delayed. You're not able to hit your contractual milestones. Your best people are firefighting instead of building. So it's all hands on deck. And eventually, what also ends up happening is that your NPS takes a hit, and there's no space really to start a conversation around expansion.
Right, right. That's really a real pain that the companies are facing for sure. So Raghav, I understand that SaaS has come a long way now. We have cloud infrastructure, APIs, no code tooling. The whole ecosystem, I feel, has really matured a lot. So why do you think that this problem still persists at this scale now?
So I'd say one of the main reasons is that implementation is still very human dependent. It's still a very manual process, and most of the knowledge around these implementations or around the product lives in people. So individuals within the organization who are either star consultants or star product folks, not necessarily in the system. So now, when you think of a product company, think about their best implementation manager. They've spent, let's say, close to 8 or 9 years at the company. They know pretty much every edge case, every configuration quirk. They know exactly what dependencies which module has on the other. So whenever, let's say, one thing breaks, they know exactly where it's going to break and what is going to sort of have a domino effect on the other, right? Now, when and uh, you know the problem is that a lot of this information is not documented. There's no wiki for it. It's all in their heads. So when they're unavailable, or let's say the star consultant that we're talking about is on vacation, there's dependency on three other projects. Uh, that knowledge ends up disappearing, either briefly, or let's say if they leave the organization permanently, right? Everything tends to queue up. All of it has this compounding effect. Now, what ends up happening is that internally in the company as well, these delays become a culturally accepted norm. So if a project slips for a week, there's a chain of messages on the Slack or your MS Teams. Someone explains the reason why it happened, and 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 you end up sort of agreeing that these things happen, right? But what's not being tracked is the compounding effect of all of these delays. So, in fact, that's the reframe that I would push every leader to kind of make as well. It's not just an operations problem. It has compounding effects across the organization. It becomes a revenue problem, and a closed deal does not become recognized by revenue till the implementation is complete. So when implementation slips, revenue recognition slips, and that's it. So yeah.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that helps. So Raghav, we have had a whole wave of tools built specifically to address this. PSA platforms, RPA project management tools. So they made things more visible. But I wanted to ask you, did it really solve the execution also?
So I mean, I'd say it's a more nuanced sort of a take, right? So these tools that were available, RPAs, PSAs, your DApps, right? They did move things, but not necessarily where it hurts the most. So when you think about PSA tools, they gave teams real visibility. You could see all your implementations in one place. Instead of generic project management tools, you were able to actually do it in the context of PS teams. So you could look at milestones, manage handoffs, and do all of this more formally, right? So this was genuinely a step forward. And then in terms of automation, RPAs came in, they took it further. So with RPAs also, you could automate a lot of the repetitive stuff, move data between systems. You could, do the automation of filling up forms, triggering notifications. So a lot of the busy work basically got automated. But both of these also kind of hit this fundamental ceiling. So these are tools that are used for organizing and executing human work. So they can help you do it more efficiently. But the challenge is that they don't replace with the judgment that goes into complex configuration decisions. They can't handle ambiguous scope. They can't look at a client's data model and figure out that what the right mapping strategy is. So what you end up having is a more organized version of the same problem. So your implementation manager still has to kind of manage a lot of the difficult calls, but it's just that they have a single interface where they can track all of this, right? Now, again, I keep going back to the HRMS example because I want to just kind of anchor it to that one type of use case. Now, let's say this same HRMS is tracked in a PSA, right? Every milestone is logged. The Slack notifications are also firing, but the core configuration problem, for example, I was talking about the leave policy setup. All of the dependencies around that is still unresolved because, and what ends up happening is that the PSA can see the delay, but it can't solve it. It can't just kind of go into the user interface or the forms or the fields and actually solve it itself.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that is really a clear ceiling on what we have until now. Uh, Raghav, let's talk about what is actually shifting. I see agentic AI gets a lot of attention these days. So can you help framing it for us as a genuine change in the execution model and not just keeping Beacon as another layer of tooling?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that distinction matters quite a bit. So, for years we built systems of record, right? So when I say systems of record, it's basically anything that uh, manages data that is business critical and kind of works on storage, retrieval, and helps with decision making, right? Now, what is emerging now is very different. We're looking at with AI, we're looking at systems of execution or systems of action. So what does is that instead of tracking the work, the system is now performing it. So a traditional automation tool will do exactly what you program it to do. So if let's say if it's got 5 steps, it will follow a sequence. It's basically a flow chart with triggers. However, with an agentic system, it works in it can sort of interpret context from multiple sources. It doesn't need to be told where to look. It can plan a sequence of actions to reach a complex goal. So, like when I talk about going from one to two, three, four, and five, it can go straight from one to five or go back to a two and then go to a three in order to perform like a complex action. Now, it's very similar when you think about implementations, right? So when you think of an implementation manager, imagine, uh, they're performing all of these complex tasks, but now imagine that with AI, imagine an implementation manager that doesn't get overwhelmed. It just sort of, does things that it's as it's told, have a perfect recall of every project without having to kind of jog their memory every time, and then are available for every client at that time. So that's sort of the direction that agents are sort of heading in. And again, like I was anchoring a lot of the other earlier examples, when you think about the same HRMS use case, you know, the the implementation manager for this HRMS will look at whatever notes came from the sales handoff or the kickoff call. They'll take their own notes as well. They'll probably build a scope document out of this, right? They'll wait for feedback after emailing it to the client, and whatever the feedback is, they'll kind of reconcile it. It keeps going back and forth, and there's weeks of calendar time that sort of gets wasted before any real configuration work is started, right? So what happens with an agentic system instead is that the moment the deal closes, an AI agent will read the full opportunity record from the CRM or any other source. It'll extract every agreed scope item. It will cross-reference it against the client intake form, flags the gap between, let's say, the standard setup and what additional configurations are required. Like let's say a multi-region permission structure, and it'll generate like a structured execution plan. All of this happens even before the kickoff call happens, and then within minutes, right? So the human in the loop, their job is kind of elevated into, instead of doing all of this grunt work, it becomes around reviewing, approving, making the calls that require the real expertise. But the agent does all the heavy lifting. So it's sort of removed a lot of the ambiguity that used to come with RPAs, and or rather, it can handle the ambiguity that RPAs couldn't. So yeah.
Okay, all right. So Raghav, I want to push on something here. Even with the agentic systems in play, what do you think? Are we still fundamentally dependent on the individuals to make the actual implementation work?
Um, yeah, so I think it's just that the nature of dependency is changing, right? So, and the distinction is very, very important. So, right now, the people dependency is on, specific failure modes. So, there's the expert bottleneck, the tribal knowledge that I was talking about. So, when you have complex implementations, they end up queuing up because your experts time bandwidth is choked. Now everyone else or every other project waits till they have the bandwidth to take over, right? Then the second piece is around this attrition. So within SaaS companies or enterprise SaaS, a lot of people move around, right? So there's a lot of attrition that ends up happening. So if your key implementation person leaves, they take years of that knowledge with them, and it's the problem is not with your hiring or your HR specifically, it's also a knowledge infrastructure problem. So it's very important to kind of codify that knowledge. Then there's the piece around the scale ceiling, right? So, the scale kind of caps at some point because you can hire more CSMs, you can hire more professional service folks, but you can't, it's very hard to kind of hire more expertise at scale. And as your customer base increases and becomes a lot more complex, that ceiling keeps getting lower. So, and then there's the time to value lag, because the more complex the client is, the more zeros there are after that deal size, uh, the longer they'll have to kind of wait before they see any sort of return on investment. And that's the delay when your competitors will sort of start calling them and sharing more details about alternatives. So I think it's there are certain experts who understand that understand the product in and out, and what ends up happening is that the configuration dependency is overloaded with them, rollouts are stalled, and there's no system that can really fill that gap. Uh, and just to kind of close on this, like I'm just gonna ask you to think about this question, right? So imagine you're a leader at an enterprise SaaS company, and just ask yourself, what you have one person who's been with the organization for close to 10 years, understands the ins and outs of the product, and is involved in almost every critical implementation there is. What happens when this person is unavailable, right? Well, it's just some food for thought.
Yeah, really, really. So Raghav, I see that you keep on using the phrase AI orchestration, and I just want to make sure that we are being very precise. A lot of people that I hear AI and they immediately just think about another chatbot or a co-pilot. So, what is AI orchestration actually, and specifically in the context of implementation delivery right now?
And I'm glad you brought that up because that's a very important distinction as well. So now, when you think about a chatbot or a co-pilot, uh, orchestration does not mean a chatbot or a co-pilot, right? So a co-pilot is 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 usually something that's sitting in someone's inbox, is maybe like a chat interface that helps them with knowledge retrieval, or will provide them with information to assist them in, let's say, a task, right? And but when you think of AI orchestration, it's a multi-agent architecture, right? It's a coordinated set of specialized agents who will sort of handle different domains. Uh, this could be, and can handle an end-to-end process or a workflow. So I'll just give you examples of other industries. So, for example, in financial services, you have multi-agent services, multi-agent systems that are underwriting complex insurance policies, and different agents handle different risk domains, check each other's outputs, and then just kind of finalize or synthesize a final decision. In logistics, you have orchestration systems that are managing supply chains across, thousands or hundreds of live variables in real time. So it's like the same architecture. That what we've done is that we've applied that to implementation delivery. So when you talk about implementation specifically, the system has distinct layers. So you've got one layer that interprets requirements, which is reading the real data. It's extracting the agreed scope. It's flagging the mismatches, and then the other piece is sort of doing the actual execution. So it's executing the workflows, the configurations, handling the data mapping, setting up the connectors, figuring out what are the standard use cases, that sort of make up the bulk of the work. And then the other one manages the delivery, so the cutover, or sort of moving from, let's say, pilot to production, or from sandbox to production, right? So it's managing the delivery, sequencing of tasks, also routing escalations. So, when you think about support, and making sure that the workflow is moving. And then finally, there's the value realization, the monitoring and adoption, uh, just to kind of figure out if a customer is not getting what they paid for.
Okay, okay. So Raghav, let's move on and understand what actually you're seeing in the live deployments. Where are the pain points? What do you think is the hurdle?
So we've seen some really good results with real deployment. So we see a significant reduction in the ambiguity around the scope. So like I mentioned, there's this gap, right, between what the sales team sold versus what the PS team is sort of implementing and the final scope of work. So that ambiguity has gone down around 70%. So when an agent reads the notes, cross references them against intake forms, these mismatches tend to get caught before they escalate, right? So, and these get caught before the kickoff call, and not necessarily during the kickoff. During the kickoff call. So that changes the entire first impression that the client has of you and the implementation process. Uh, and we're seeing almost 3x improvement in time to value as well, because a lot of manual dependencies have been eliminated. So the system handles standard data mapping to sort of the work of kind of doing it. It's only the very unique sort of edge cases that go to like a human consultant. And normally your professional services and CS teams spend their time on these things, which ends up, sort of pushing timelines. Now, what they can do is they can spend all their bandwidth on stuff that actually needs their judgment, right? Then, apart from that, there's the communication overhead. So there's endless back and forth of looking at messages, emails. There's uh, there's a lot of manual curation of this information that's also required. And what ends up happening is with the orchestration layer, you can send proactive updates automatically at every milestone. So, the client is aware of where things stand at each stage. And honestly, the most impactful, I'd say, is there's zero delays that happen due to missing expertise. You're not bottlenecked by tribal knowledge, and because this expertise is sort of codified and or encoded in the system, so it doesn't go on leave, it doesn't quit, it doesn't get pulled into another project, or have to kind of decide on the priorities and things like that. So it's also changes the way you look at scale, right? So it's not necessarily around hiring more experts to grow, but it's about how do you sort of codify this knowledge of your experts, and then that's what kind of compounds the impact as well.
Okay, all right. So Raghav, let's move on and try to understand specifically about the execution level. So from what I know, there are 6 to 12 weeks that are compressed significantly during the execution. So wanted to understand what is it that actually is collapsing and what's the reason behind it?
Sure. So yeah, I think uh, I'd like to go about it in a little more detail, because this is where it actually gets tangible for a lot of teams as well. So normally what ends up happening is that scoping traditionally takes 2 to 5 days of alignment calls and email threads, right? Now, what I'm showing right now is the overall process, right? So we've sort of broken this down into 6 stages, and the first one is the inception or the scoping, right? Now, the second piece is, kind of converting all of this knowledge that you've gathered during scoping to the product, right? How do you kind of map the custom data, the map the fields, get the right kind of connectors or build those connectors. Now, normally, this something like this used to take, anywhere from 1 week to upwards of 3 weeks, and this would depend on the complexity. Now, with agents, with AI agents, you can handle the standard cases on their own, and only kind of surface, like I was mentioning, the true edge cases to the human consultants. So you're basically able to do this in hours instead of weeks, and in some cases even minutes, right? And now the other piece is the client communication. So instead of your uh, PS managers or CSMs, having to remember to send a status update, uh, the orchestration layer can kind of take care of all of that. So, and at every milestone, and you can even sort of set up what some of those milestones are, so you can kind of customize that based on your internal processes. Then there's the escalations. There is what ends up happening is that if there is an escalation, you have to go through like a detailed RC or root cause analysis. You have to do retrospective 2 weeks after it happened. And now with AI, you can kind of do that in real time. So these escalations happen immediately with the right person. You've got all the right context, and it's sort of happening in the right moment. So you can take calls in real time rather than have to wait for like a week or 2 weeks, right? And then the next piece is the timelines around the go live. So implementations that were, running at 6 to 12 weeks now are coming down to 2 to 4 weeks, right? With AI orchestration, and with the same level of complexity. So it's the same quality of output, but a fraction of the man hours that are required to sort of get there. And this compression is sort of possible because of you know eliminating, or actually automating, or kind of orchestrating all the different pieces that used to take time in implementation, right? So now it's not bottlenecked by hard expert work. It's all the coordination, the expertise, running after different people for sign-offs, syncing teams, and just kind of reconciling all the conflicting information. All of this is kind of collapsed thanks to AI orchestration. And uh, what the humans are involved for is, their skills and their judgment. So that's where they kind of get involved.
That's really interesting, Raghav. So, to pull everything together, you are now describing a shift from people dependent execution to more of a system driven execution now. So, what does that look like across the dimensions that matter the most to the business leaders involved?
Sure. Um, yeah, so maybe I'll walk you through it dimension by dimension. And, you know, I would also encourage you and everyone sort of watching this to compare it with what their current reality is. So the first piece is, I'll talk about scope creation. Now, when you think about people dependent, it means that there is a PS personnel or a CSM manually documenting the handoff calls, and just hoping that they've not missed anything, right? So missed any details. With system driven, it basically means that the AI is reading not just the kickoff call, or the intake forms, but also the deal record. It's looking at all the sales conversations, and from that it kind of auto drafts the scope and routes it for human approval, and usually with a very high degree of confidence, right? Now, when you think about the configuration piece, uh, when you talked about people dependent, it meant that every non-standard setup would queue behind an expert. But when you think about system driven, it's an agent handling it with escalation to a human consultant as the fallback, but not the human consultant as the starting point. So a large part of the heavy lifting is already done, and they only get involved where their skills are truly required. And then there's the client update piece, which I've kind of covered earlier as well. So, a human doesn't have to remember to send updates. With system driven, it's a lot more proactive, it's orchestrated communication, and at every milestone, and you can set up those milestones, and it gets sent to the clients automatically. Um, Now with delays, because the process was a lot more people dependent, uh, it would end up becoming a systemic problem. People would start accepting it. They would start sort of provide explanations, maybe do a root cause analysis around it, but then it would just kind of get hidden in certain Slack conversations and things like that. But with system driven, they get flagged in real time and escalated immediately to the right person with complete context. And then there's the expertise. So with people dependent, it means that your institutional knowledge is limited to a certain set of people, and when they leave, it walks out of the door with them. And with system driven, all of this knowledge is codified in agents and is available to you permanently. And I've talked about all of this, but I think the one that matters the most to leaders is the revenue impact, because when you're people dependent, you have to find out that implementation, a particular implementation is creating revenue risk during the close of a quarter, and in most cases it's too late to do anything about it. But with system driven, because it's all of the risks are kind of shared in real time, so the revenue risk is also visible live. So you can sort of act before it becomes like a number that you've missed for that particular quarter.
That's really a lot that we have covered today, Raghav. So, what is the one deal breaker takeaway that you want everyone who is watching this webinar to take away from this discussion?
Yeah, so yeah, I think I started off by saying that if your product is not winning, it's probably not with your product, and I'd say that that's something that that every viewer should sort of take home with them. A lot of times, it's what happens after the deal is closed, and we speak to a lot of professional services leaders, we speak to a lot of CS leaders, and a lot of them are struggling with churn, and a large chunk of that is because of slow time to value, because implementations are chaotic even though they have a great product, and almost always. And but what ends up happening is that the product doesn't even get a chance to shine or show real value, because because of failures during the implementation stage, or before the customer could even see the product succeed. And we covered a lot, like you said, we covered a lot of ground. We talked about PSA, we talked about RPA, DApps, and whatnot, right? So made they helped us hedge some of that risk and manage that failure a little better, but I don't think they solved it, right? So uh, and to be honest, AI orchestration is a step in that direction, where we actually want to address the root cause, not just organize that work, but also encode that expertise, align the teams, and just kind of execute the delivery of that system. So yeah, if today's webinar felt familiar and you feel like your implementation is stagnating somewhere, we'd love to show you, how AI can run a system, and feel free to reach us at Beacon.li.
Correct, correct. Perfectly said, Raghav. So, my takeaway was three things. I would leave everyone else also to take away. First is that implementation failure is just not a revenue problem. It is just not an ops problem. The tool we have had until now, it really helped, but they were not actually solving the people dependency at the core. And AI orchestration is changing that, not just by replacing the teams, but by turning what they know into a system that is actually scaling. So, thank you, Raghav. This is exactly the kind of honest conversation we were looking forward to. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annie, and this was a fun chat. Thanks to everyone who joined us. Really appreciate you taking the time. Please feel free to reach us at beacon.li.
Thank you.